Good evening. Can you all hear me, more or less? If you can hear me, it's probably a good sign that you'll be able to hear Paul. My name is Marty Jaffe, and I am the acting director of the Jackson School of International Studies for this year. Acting director. In real life, I'm a professor of Jewish studies and comparative religion at the University of Washington. And I've been here for 14 years and have loved virtually every minute of it except for the last 9 months when I was acting director of the Jackson School of International Studies. But I didn't come here to tell jokes. My task is to introduce our lecturer, whom most of you have already learned a good deal about, Paul Mendes-Flor. The task of introducing the third of Paul's lectures on post-traditional Jewish identities is, I find, a bit intimidating. For my job is no longer to tell the audience how brilliant and accomplished the Stroum Lecture is, which you heard on the first night, nor is it to remind them a second time of his eminence, which is the job of the second introducer. My job, as they tell me, is to remind everyone what Paul has said. And that's what I'm going to try to do here, and I find that a very intimidating and frightening project, not least because his message is not necessarily one of comfort or solace. And that's what I want to talk about for a moment. Professor Mendes-Flor has been suggesting to us that one of the fundamental assumptions that link contemporary Jewries to past Jewries, that is, the assumption that there is some essential Jewish trait that binds the Jews together over time and space into a unified people. This assumption is and has always been, I think he would agree, a consoling fiction. It is, especially at the dawn of the new century, moreover, a dangerous fiction from which we must be freed. The consolations it provides are no longer worth the distortions they engender. This, I take it, is the basic thrust of the term post-traditional, as Paul has been using the term. Jews have entered a cultural moment in which we perceive every attempt to create a tradition of Jewish peoplehood as hopelessly mired in an ideological hall of mirrors. We perceive ourselves in a series of problematic reflections that defer indefinitely our efforts to recover an identity rooted in the solidity of a uniform or even a mutually intelligible cultural idiom. We don't know who we are or who the others are who we call Jews. The first lecture on the cultural disjunctions of modern Jewish identity brought to mind the constructed artifice that constitutes the various identities through which the self comes to know its place in the world. The great ideological constructions of post-emancipation Jewish identity, all of them we know as Judaism today: Reform, Orthodoxy, Conservative Judaism, Hasidism, Zionism, Bundism, Buddhism, as we learned. All of these energized enormous sectors of Jewry and created modern Jewish identities as we now know them and as we experience them. But each has solidified into a brittle ideological structure that suffocates new projects of Jewish self-expression, even as they claim to be their precondition. What all these share, Paul tells us, is the illusion that the Jewish self is shaped by an unchanging and self-identical historical essence. In his second lecture, we learned how Jewish cultural memory can in fact be interrogated to disclose the multifaceted and multi-identified character of Jewry. That what appears as essential and primordial and a fact of nature, something as close to us or closer to us than our own skins, is rather the result of construction and negotiation, a multicultural reality that only appears to us its creators as an essence at all. Consider the great metaphor of Franz Rosenzweig's bookshelves, as Paul described them to us in the second lecture. I was very struck by this, and I thought I'd steal the metaphor and work it for a little while. It's all right, we go back. I'm allowed to steal from Paul. I've stole a lot of things from Paul that he gave very willingly. The Jewish books on one side of the library engaging in dialogue with the European books across the way. But what are these Jewish books of Rosenzweig but the record of Jewish identities constructed in constant cultural absorption of the non-Jewish other? What is the Bible itself but a formation of Jewish identity grounded in the ongoing dialogue with the Canaanites in the land and the invaders from without? What would Rosenzweig's Mishnah have been without the rabbinic encounter with the great legal culture of Rome? And where would the Babylonian Talmud have come from without the Mesopotamian cultural traditions that inform its disputes? Finally, what Maimonidean achievement can be imagined without the Jewish mastery of Islamic jurisprudence and philosophy that was itself earlier Greco-Roman jurisprudence and philosophy? Thus, even the great Rosenzweig was in error. His Jewish library was as interpenetrated by the nations of the world as was his library of Kultur. The dialogue had happened before he set his Jewish books on one side of the room and his European books on the other. Professor Mendes-Flor will, I believe, propose to us tonight a way of shaping a range of postmodern Jewish identities which avoids the false essentialism of the modern era. We will see if he shall succeed. He does so at a precarious cultural moment when political and cultural forces on all sides of us make the retreat to essentialism enormously attractive and alluring. We should wonder as he speaks what he will say about Torah in modern Jewish identity. Where can authoritative knowledge be found if all sources of authority are constructed and provisional? And if there are no sources of authority, what can serve to validate any Jewish cultural creativity at all? He will now speak to us about Jewish learning and Jewish hope. I will want to know from Paul, what shall the topic of our learning be, and what shall we hope for as its result? Can Jewish learning be Torah if it bears no authority? And can learning be Jewish if it is not Torah? So Paul, let's take it away.
Good evening. Just to arrest Marty's anxiety about purloining, taking from me a word of wisdom from Heinrich Heine, who said once that in the world of Geist, the world of learning, there is no plagiarism. So you're welcome. And I, of course, plagiarized others as well. Since I arrived in Seattle last Sunday, I've been bathed in luxuriant and warm hospitality. And I don't have adequate words to express my gratitude to all those who have reached out and but very successfully made me feel at home and welcome in your very, very beautiful city. And I can only say, Toda Rabba, thank you very, very much. And I hope one day I'll have the opportunity to reciprocate in Jerusalem. One at a time, please, or two. But indeed, thank you. The gentlemen, this happened 3 days, they've put all these little machines on me. And I must tell them, as an Israeli, it's a little I get a little anxious about these machines. You know, we have a problem. And it's only out of good faith that I stand here with. But as you press those buttons, I'm going to have a little bit of anxiety. But anyway, I hope you keep them under control. And I'm looking for my reading glasses. Here they are. Right. I had the occasion last week to visit the Burke Museum, which has a wonderful exhibit, small exhibit, a beautiful exhibit about native cultures in this region under the titles Pacific Voices, Worlds in Our Community. And at the end of that exhibit, there's a panel that reads in the following fashion. Though each of our cultures is different, we all draw a sense of identity from our languages and stories, teachers and ceremonies. These shape our cultures that live on through our children and through others whom we touch. There are, of course, indeed, many voices and cultural worlds within our respective communities. And this we celebrate today as multiculturalism. I, however, spoke not only of multiculturalism, but multiculturalism which is part of our own diverse, complex, maybe even neurotic inner world. We are a breed of many, many cultures. We are a skein of many different voices that we have internalized by virtue of our modernity. The American sociologist, actually born in Vienna, but that's America, Peter Berger, many years ago, not so many, about I think it's like 10 years ago, wrote a book called The Heretical Imperative. Some of you may know the book. He returns to the etymology, the root meaning of the word heresy, which means to choose. Heresia in Greek is to choose. And playing with that, he says, today we choose what we read, we choose what we wear, we choose the glasses we purchase, we choose the residence in which we reside, we choose the communities in which we reside. He takes the image of a supermarket. Today we live in a supermarket of culture. We grab this and that, and at the end we have a remarkable blend of various items we've taken from this world supermarket of cultures. The image of a supermarket is perhaps, at least in my judgment, a bit vulgar. I prefer the image of a university, which I alluded to last time. The university, of course, derives from the word universe. All cultures are part of all cultures are bounded through our curiosity. We lay claim to every culture as being part of our own humanity. A good liberal arts education, of course, seeks to promote such an understanding of culture. We dabble in a little bit of everything. In the end, the question is, whether we have anything or just a little of everything. But that's another question which, of course, is addressed to our educators. But as a way of grasping, a way of articulating the essence of a modern world, the university, I think, is the image, the appropriate image. All aspects of human culture are seen to potentially nurture our soul. As I said in Hebrew, Shoresh Nishmatenu, the source of us, the roots nurturing our soul, extend in a variety of directions, from China to Japan to the black culture to Hispanic culture, and of course also Jewish culture and everything else I left out. That's the image I've been pursuing, and I'd like to continue that this evening. My question, however, is a more basic one. Assuming my presupposition that we are a skein of many different cultures, that we are children of the university in its deepest sense, then the question is how we can be heretics in Berger's sense, to choose from a variety of cultures, to self-consciously extend beyond our primordial culture, the culture in which we're born into, and lay claim to other expressions of our humanity. If you wish, to be eclectic citizens of the world and its manifold cultures, and yet still passionate Jews, informed, committed, and responsible Jews. Of course, when I say Jews, we could substitute it for Eskimos, Catholics, Mormons, or any other culture, but our specific concern is how post-traditional Jews, that is, as Marty very well noted, the condition of being citizens of a much larger universe than simply our Jewishness. How we may be open, respectful of others, those of different cultures and faiths, and indeed to regard ourselves as one with them, to see the other, as Walt Whitman said in his wonderful poem, Song of Myself, to see in the other oneself, an aspect of oneself, and at the same time to be true to one's distinctive culture and faith. In the second lecture, I proposed a mechanism which perhaps would allow us to be indeed citizens of an eclectic universe, and yet also passionate Jews. And that mechanism I borrowed in the sense of Heine, from two German scholars who've been over many years struggling with these issues as well, Aleida and Jan Assmann. And the concept is, as you recall, is called cultural memory. Mark, however, that cultural memory is not a synonym for what we often call collective memory. Indeed, Jan and Aleida Assmann, I should be polite, Aleida, she's the woman, and Jan Assmann, have sought to correct what they regard as a superficiality of the concept collective memory and to provide it with nuance. Some of the nuance I sought to elaborate during my last lecture. Just briefly, the adjective culture as used, or cultural as used in the term cultural memory, demarcates a large ambit, a large scope. It includes books, music, sentiments, humor, customs, folklore, dance, cuisine, conventions, gestures, language, and the peculiar inflections of speech of a given community, idioms, fairy tales, whatever. in addition to formal, traditional, and canonical literature. That is to say, cultural memory includes much more than our 5 C's. Remember, creed, cult, code, community, and covenant, which demarcated traditional Judaism. The Osmonds include one other crucial, or note, one other crucial element with respect to cultural memory. And Scott, was perhaps the only one in the audience who will appreciate it. Jan Osmond, as you know, is an Egyptologist and has access to classical language. And he coined a term based on Greek, ancient Greek rhetoric, hypolepsis. And the term that means in Greek rhetoric is when you respond to somebody, you use their language and you integrate it, such that a conversation is always building upon itself. So he thus, on the basis of this very esoteric term, but of course an interesting term, he claims that he and his wife claim that cultural memory is hypoleptic. That is to say, it constantly refers to itself. It creates what Wittgenstein would call a word game. A game is the wrong term, of course, but that's the way we use. But a system of a certain language which we recognize. And thus is a conversation, a discourse, which when you enter it, you would recognize it. Certain key terms, certain references. It is hypoleptic. And I'll expand upon that later, of course, in a different language. But what is crucial here for us is that, as in every living discourse, it is dynamic. Cultural memory is dynamic. It's malleable. It's responsive to new experiences and insights. Insights drawn from a whole gamut of life and reading and emotion, imagination. But those new insights are integrated in a given discourse, hypoleptically, if you wish. To grasp this, one may just think about language, the analog to language. We provide our children, I met Monty, had the honor, the grace to meet Monty's wonderful daughter, and of course she speaks very well at the age of 6, but you probably remember, all of us remember, raising our children, and slowly they acquire knowledge of language. You provide them with a vocabulary, a grammar. You don't do it consciously, but we do it, and the syntax. They learn the rules, and yet playing with language, they create something new. We all create something new, though we are working within a certain system. In an analogous way, this is what we mean by cultural memory. It has a certain set of, a whole gamut of gestures, language, stories, memories, etc. But if it's dynamic, it's not simply repeated. It's created anew as we use the language and integrate new experiences, insights, and the like. Franz Rosenzweig once referred to Jewish tradition as providing Jews with a common landscape. In the past, he noted, in this landscape there was one highway in which all Jews tread. That was what we call tradition. Not only in the sense of learning, but in the sense of course, action and deed. Today, and I'll interpolate, in our post-traditional setting, we have that common landscape. I call it cultural memory, but each Jew forges his or her own path within that landscape. Rosenzweig also had, as perhaps you know, and we'll mention it briefly in the lecture itself. Now I'm just babbling as a preface, but there's a lecture that comes. Rosenzweig and Martin Buber had a dispute regarding the role of the mitzvot, the ritual precepts in the life of the Jew. Rosenzweig, as you all know, sought to reaffirm the mitzvot, to reground his own life as a caring, thoughtful, responsible Jew in religious practice, and Martin Buber had another path. And they had a major dispute. But Rosenzweig noted what is important is that you engage me in this dispute. You're not indifferent to the questions I raise. I'll just read briefly from the letter, which says it so much more articulately. We would be parting ways with one another only if you were to feel it unnecessary for you, being a Jew, to say yes or no. In other words, to be indifferent, but to engage in the debate, even though we may take on various and divergent positions, is what's crucial. We participate in the discourse of being Jews. We participate in the cultural memory. In this lecture, I will present Buber and Rosenzweig as guides in the reconstruction of Jewish cultural memory as an ongoing process, a process that knows no closure, neither from within, that is from oneself, or from without, that is from the community. For Buber and Rosenzweig, Jewish cultural memory was grounded in a theological commitment. That is, Jewish knowledge and learning were for them, Buber and Rosenzweig, anchored in religious faith. What I should like to highlight is not their religious faith, however, but their implicit understanding of Judaism as a shared cultural memory and discourse. I'll begin with a little story. It is told that on a stroll in Berlin, in a Berlin park, and we even know the park, the wonderful botanic gardens doesn't compare to your beautiful gardens here, but nonetheless, wonderful botanic gardens in Berlin. Franz Kafka met a little girl weeping over the loss of her doll. Kafka sought to comfort her, explaining that he just saw the doll running out of the park, and that she explained she was going on a long trip, and that if he saw the girl, in other words, the mother of the doll, he should explain to her that she had to go suddenly on this long voyage, very urgently, that she was sorry she wasn't able to say goodbye, but every day she'll be sending her a letter. And she asked Kafka if he would pick up the post and bring it to her. And so was every day Kafka would come with a letter from the girl's wandering doll, and she would read the letter with great eagerness. Beautiful little letters, we can imagine. Finally, Kafka had to leave Berlin to travel to a sanatorium where he, within a few weeks, would die, as we all know, of tuberculosis. He made one last visit to the park at the appointed hour, this time not bringing a doll, not bringing a letter, but a doll. And the girl looked at the doll. That's not my doll. He says, well, it's true, she looks different. But as you know, we only go on a long, long journey. We have new experiences, and we often change. The doll is the same in essence, although her countenance, her appearance is different. And the girl, of course, accepted the doll as hers. This tale is related by the late Israeli philosopher Ernst Akiva Simon to illustrate what he celebrates as a second naivete, or if you wish, second innocence. That innocence which is necessary to regain faith after having experienced the purgatory of secularization. But the tale of Kafka's effort to comfort the child over the loss of a doll may also be understood as a parable of the desired second naivete itself. The doll, the original innocence, is lost. And what eventually comes in its place is not really a replacement, but merely bears the marks of its travels to distant and alien lands. The doll, reborn, re-embodied, the second innocence, has a different countenance, because she cannot, and perhaps does not wish to, rid herself of the memories and all that she has learned during her journeys. Such indeed is the second naivete, of which Simon, following the Catholic philosopher Peter Wust, speaks. The attitude that allows the children of the Enlightenment to affirm religious faith bears within its bosom the doubts, uncertainties, and skepticism attendant to the secular experience. Faith is achieved not by denying or rejecting the insights and sensibilities of modern secular culture. Rather, they are honored, and as Hegelian would say, forgive the term, aufgehoben, means elevated and integrated into a new cognitive posture, a new way of thinking about the world. While remaining alert to the critical canons and the skeptical reflexes of the secular order, a second naivete allows one to encounter the presence of God, to be open to the transcendent claims of tradition, and to humble oneself in prayer. The difficulty of achieving this second innocence is perhaps no more poignantly depicted than by Kafka. He desperately sought such an innocence in love and in faith, and both eluded him. His encounter with the little girl, which took place shortly before his death, 2 weeks shy of his 41st birthday, was but a game, a fantasy he shared with the girl, a brief interlude in his tortured life, buffeted by ambivalence, fear, and distrust. His fanciful play with the child was no more than an indication of what he longed for, but knew that the adult world which he perforce inhabited denied him. Kafka understood his existence and that of each of us to be under the curse of the expulsion from paradise. Having eaten of the tree of knowledge, we are no longer able to behold the divine presence in spontaneous innocence. Eager to taste the fruit of the tree of knowledge, we deprive ourselves of the nurturance of the tree of life. To be sure, Kafka acknowledged, with the revelation of his Torah, God graced us with another opportunity to gain access to the tree of life. He well realized that the revealed Torah, the divine law which frees life of its ever-confounding ambiguities and provides existence with a coherent, just structure, is, as the rabbis proclaim, the tree of life. But for Kafka, a denizen of the modern world, the law is no longer intelligible. And although he so profoundly wished to comprehend it, he could not. Kafka's contemporaries, Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, jointly became the principal symbol and guides of 20th century Jewry's quest for the spiritual renewal and retrieval of a second naivete. A retrieval that requires a careful reconstruction of Jewish cultural memory for a post-traditional Jewry. Despite his passionate yearning for a second naivete, Kafka's skepticism and distrust were probably too unbending to yield to the theological discourse of Buber and Rosenzweig. Although he seems not to have known Rosenzweig, whose major writings were not yet widely circulated before Kafka passed away, Kafka, did know Buber personally and was inspired by several of Buber's Hasidic stories, which found their way into his writings. But he was also frightened by the implicit appeal to folk solidarity borne by Buber's Hasidic tales. Not that Kafka lacked such sentiments, but Jewish responsibility based solely on such sentiments he found oppressive and unacceptable. He would require something more, and whatever that power might be, he feared he would never have the resolve to accept it. His incorrigible ambivalence pinioned by his ability to affirm anything with certainty, with unbridled conviction. All relations and commitments could at most be engaged with a wary tentativeness, and thus would invariably falter. He passionately yearned for relationships and commitment, and yet he could not fully allow himself either. As a Jew, he longed for the innocence of faith and an unambiguous bond to his people and its traditions. But his recurrent efforts to achieve a creative relationship to Judaism and the Jewish people all led to an emotional cul-de-sac. Kafka has been regarded as an emblem of the modern Jew, for he seems to give expression to its predicament, to the predicament of the modern Jewish experience, albeit in extreme and hyperbolic fashion. He himself thought of himself, I quote, the most typical West European Jew, as he wrote to a lady friend. This means, expressed with exaggeration, that not one calm second is granted me. Nothing is granted me. Everything has to be earned. Not only the present and the future, but the past too, what we call cultural memory. Something, after all, which perhaps every human being has inherited. This too must be earned. It is perhaps the hardest work. When the earth turns to the right, I'm not sure that it does. I would have to turn to the left to make up for the past. But as it is, I haven't the least particle of strength for this and these obligations. I can't carry the world on my shoulders. Can barely place my winter coat on them. End of quote. Kafka's predicament, with due consideration of his hyperbola, his exaggeration, was indeed shared by his fellow Western Jews. How to retrieve the Jewish past and an innocent faith without forfeiting knowledge and its skeptical scruples. How to affirm traditional wisdom without undergoing a mental lobotomy, exercising, ripping out, if you wish, Western culture and its secular sensibilities. How to eat of the tree of knowledge and partake in the sweetness of the tree of life. Sociologically, Kafka's and the modern Jew's predicament may be also understood as that of one trapped by the ethic of liberal individualism. The Western or liberal ideal of liberty held that one is first and foremost a human being, an individual. Unencumbered by feudal restrictions, the individual's fortunes were now to be determined solely by one's talents, enterprise, and merit. Graced by liberty, one was also accorded the right to define oneself independent of one's inherited culture and its expectations. Under the banner of liberty, one need not acknowledge any primordial loyalties. One was free to develop one's personality, interests, and talents in utter disregard of the dictates and precepts of one's parents' tradition. But the ethic of a free individualism has also often meant isolation and a loss of community. As former residents of the ghetto, Jews were naturally drawn to the ideal of liberty, and in ever-increasing numbers embraced the ethic of a free individualism. With the emancipation of the Jews, the Jewish individual was liberated. Her or his talent, and enterprise were duly rewarded. The annals of the modern world amply record the many splendid achievements of talented and enterprising Jews. To be sure, in pursuit of their personal dignity and well-being, not all Jewish votaries, followers of the liberal ethos, felt obliged to break with Jewish tradition. But surely, to varying degrees, many did. Perhaps they were beguiled by the vision of the German writer Johann Gottfried Herder, that a new liberal order, I quote, "No one will any longer ask who is a Jew and who is a Christian." One assumed that despite all the nasty resistance to the new order, and especially to the Jews' putative role in it, one's background was ultimately irrelevant. The liberal era was said to pave the way to a neutral society in which the accidents of one's birth would be neutralized and rendered insignificant. But the liberal order, as the historian Jakob Katz has observed, was not quite, and perhaps can never be, as neutral as envisioned by its more febrile prophets, for it was hardly bereft of particular historical memories and ethnic and religious sentiments. Even in the most insistently liberal countries, a civil religion arose to occupy the space supposedly reserved for the neutral society. A public culture emerged, embroidered with the symbols and myths and rites drawn from the historical experience of the nation and often from the dominant religion. In virtually all liberal societies in the West, public culture was in effect colored by what may be best characterized as a laicized or secularized Christianity. In the employ of the laity and shared social and cultural values, the Christian motifs of the civil religion, it may be claimed, was so theologically diluted as to be rendered innocuous. The laicized Christianity of the civil religion became offensive only when enjoined by true believers, that is, those who insisted on the pristine theological contents of that which was borrowed from Christianity, or when harnessed to an ethnic nationalism. As such, civil religion manifestly conflicted with the liberal ethos. By projecting shared values and purpose, civil religion may be viewed as the modern state's attempt to provide a sense of community and thereby compensate for the loss or at least attenuation of traditional religious and communal bonds. From this perspective, nationalism may be viewed as an intensification of civil religion and the attendant sense of community. The more passionate the nationalism, the greater the sense of community, but as such, the more it threatens the liberal ethic of a free individualism. Needless to say, Jewish liberals in particular would be threatened by a civil religion bearing the exclusive inflections of Christianity and ethnic nationalism. Both Buber and Rosenzweig realized that the challenge posed by the liberal predicament was not simply to provide Jews with their own civil religion and ethnic nationalism, and this will be one of my salient overarching points, that a cultural memory is not to be identified with civil religion and ethnic nationalism. Indeed, it is presented to you as an alternative. Both appreciated, that is, both Buber and Rosenzweig appreciated that though disaffected by the ethic of a free individualism, Jewry, for the most part, was not ready to compromise other liberal values. The parochialism of ethnic nationalism could hardly appeal to one who still adhered to the universal vision of liberal humanism. And the external, seemingly contrived trappings of a civil religion could hardly satisfy the spiritual yearnings of many of their generation. Accordingly, Buber and Rosenzweig taught that the renewal of Jewish community must be grounded in the renewal of Judaism as a spiritual reality of transcendent and thus universal significance. Buber spoke as a Zionist. In contrast to political and cultural Zionists, however, he spoke of the personal Jewish question. He spoke to the individual Jew, acknowledging, and I quote, the great ambivalence, the boundless despair, the prophetic inner chaos of many of today's Jews. He told Jewish youth, disaffected with their parents' assimilation and with their bourgeois ideals, that human personality could never achieve fulfillment in isolation. Human personality, Buber contended, only truly flowers in community and the acceptance of a call to super-personal tasks. What these tasks might be was no longer clear, however. They cannot be determined, Buber emphasized, by a mere return to Jewish tradition, by a return to an inherited custom primed by some sense of fidelity, a desire for community, or conviction that tradition per se is the font of Jewish authenticity. An affirmation of tradition out of motives extraneous to faith cannot but deaden true religious sensibility. For while, and I quote again, tradition constitutes the noblest freedom for a generation that lives it meaningfully, it is the most miserable slavery for a habitual inheritors who merely accept it tenaciously and complacently. End of quote. Pride and defiance, even when clothed in the garments of tradition, cannot be the basis of a spiritually truthful Jewish existence. Judaism must once again become an autonomous reality. That's Buber's term, autonomous reality, a spiritual power that is neither contrived nor feigned, but existentially genuine and thus compelling. That Judaism could be such a power was Buber's that Judaism can be such a power was Buber's most fundamental and abiding conviction. It was also Buber's conviction that the renewal of Judaism as a spiritual power could not be affected by the mere adoption of a set of creeds and ritual practices. Remember our C's: code, creed, and cult. Even the affirmation of a Jewish national identity, the C of community, although necessary in and of itself, is insufficient. Indeed, Jewish renewal is not a question of renewing this or that aspect, doctrine, or practice. For Judaism is a multifarious, ongoing spiritual process. That's Buber's term, spiritual process, which one only distorts when one seeks to grasp it creedally and ritually. Orthodox and liberal attempts to define the essence of Judaism, in fact, have done a grave disservice to Judaism as a creative spiritual process, a process, moreover, that unfolds in the life of Jewish individuals and not in creedal catechisms or ritual manuals. Genuine renewal, again quoting, must originate in deeper regions of the people's spirit. That is, Judaism must be renewed as a spiritual process engaging the life, the existence, the imagination, the soul of the Jewish individual. Again quoting, only such a life can create not merely an aggressive or defensive, but a positive consciousness of peoplehood. Only when the individual Jew feels him or herself to be part of a spiritual process, cultural memory, if you wish, shared with fellow Jews, can one properly speak of a renewal of Judaism. And since the deeper reality of Judaism as a spiritual process cannot be defined in abstract terms, and allegiance to a particular conception to Jewish deed and practice is besides the point. Access to the spiritual process in Buber's judgment can only be attained through the study of the sacred texts of Judaism, the Bible, Midrash, Kabbalah, and Hasidika. Again quoting, the scroll of words and deeds whose letters tell the chronicle of the Jewish people's relation to its God, and record the recurrent struggle of Israel, the Jewish people, from the patriarchs to the Baal Shem Tov, to find symbols and a language to express this relationship. Reconnecting with this corpus of symbols and modes of expression allows the individual Jew to find a way to articulate his or her own personal struggle to comprehend the encounter with the divine. And I quote, "How could an adequate response develop in individual man?" Of course, Buber, the German word is Mensch, which means both men and women. So the sexism is not Buber's intention, but I won't amend the text other than alert you. When he says man, he means Mensch, which is beyond gender, or includes both genders. How could an inadequate response develop in an individual man? How could he even conceive of an appropriate symbol were he not part of the continuity of mankind's spiritual process? Response and symbol, however, are given to individual man directly in the absolute, that is, the religiously creative life of his people. Here, mankind's wordless dialogue with God is condensed for him into the language of the soul, which he is not merely able to understand, but to which he himself can add new expressions as yet unspoken. Without this language, he could do no more than stammer and falter. Without a bond to his people, man remains amorphous and adrift when God calls him. It is only from this bond that he derives contour and substance, so that he can dare to confront his caller. You'll remember what I said in my prefatory comments about the hyperleptic aspect of cultural memory, that we quote, that we use a language of the tradition in order to express things anew. For Buber, the renewal of Judaism as a spiritual process had a decisive intellectual dimension. Jewish renewal thus requires a resolve to participate anew in the ever-unfolding process of Jewish learning. Let me repeat, ever-unfolding process of Jewish learning and spiritual creativity. Again, if you indulge, I'll quote, "We must therefore reject commitment to a claim that Jewish teaching is something finished and unequivocal. For us, it is neither. It is rather a gigantic process, still uncompleted, of spiritual creativity and creative response to the unconditional. It is in this process that we want to participate with our conscious, active life in the hope that we, too, may not be denied a creative spark. But to achieve this participation, we must fully discern this process, discern not merely some of its isolated aspects or effects, not only maxims or theses, but in earnest awareness its whole development up to the present, recreating it in its entirety from within." I trust, Marty, you're getting an answer to your question, slowly. Buber explored various hermeneutical strategies for revitalizing this process, which was threatened in the modern period with utter ossification, stagnation, finally focusing on what he called the dialogical principle, which we're all familiar from his great book, I and Thou, Notion of Dialogue. But it would, of course, be mistaken to understand dialogue as merely a principle for reading sacred texts and retrieving their meaning. For Buber, reading these texts dialogically bore directly upon the overarching and urgent goal of living a Jewish life, of personal fulfillment and responsibility. Buber attached to the study of sacred texts not only hermeneutical, maybe it's Buber, I don't know. Yeah. All my regards. Buber attached to the study of sacred texts not only hermeneutical and existential significance, however. The study of these texts also had an intrinsic theological importance for him, representing a realm of unconditionality, the absolute, or what Buber's friend Paul Tillich, the great Protestant theologian, called ultimate concern. Sacred literature and its studies serve to detach one from the immediate environment, in German, Umwelt, the world that surrounds us, of mundane cares and objectives. And I quote from Buber, "Unbinding our soul from the utilitarian bustle of everyday life, the study of sacred texts directs one toward unconditional truths and tasks. Sacred detachment from the mundane, of course, is but a dialectical pause. Spiritually quickened by the study of sacred texts, one returns to the here and now." And again, forgive me, I quote, "For renewal must also mean that the Spirit enters life only when Judaism once again reaches out like a hand grasping each Jew by the hair of his head." He hasn't touched me, of course. "And carrying him in the tempest raging between heaven and earth towards Jerusalem, as the hand of the Lord once grasps and carries Ezekiel, the priest, in the land of the Chaldeans. Only then will the Jewish people be ready to build a new destiny for itself, where the old one once broke down into fragments. The bricks may be, indeed, must be assembled now, but the house can be built only when the people have once more become builders." I mean, we're responsible for rebuilding Judaism through participating in this process in a knowledgeable fashion. Builders. By reintegrating his or herself into the spiritual fabric of Jewish community and cultural memory, Buber taught the individual Jew acquires not only a language and symbolic universe allowing for personal fulfillment, namely the ability for a cogent and sustained spiritual expression. But at the same time, he or she also becomes a builder in the reconstruction of Judaism, battered by the confusions attendant to the entry of Jewry into the liberal order initiated by the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Builders is an image borrowed from a famous midrash. And I quote from the midrash, "And all thy children shall be taught the law of the Lord, and great shall be the peace of thy children." And the midrash continues. That was a quote actually from Isaiah. "Do not read by naich, thy children, but bonaich, thy builders." And of course, all know that in Hebrew we just write the consonants and the vowels you bluff, or you know, and you introduce them. So the root word in Isaiah can be read as banaich, your children. But if you introduce other alternative vowels, it can be bonaich, your builders. Referring to the same midrash, Rosenzweig questioned Buber's summary rejection of the mitzvot, the traditional ritual precepts set by tradition, as a proper context of Jewish spirituality and divine service. As you know, Buber insisted that we, in this particular juncture in our lives, both individually and communally, we must learn first to serve God in the marketplace, where it's, of course, very difficult. If you have in your mind a marketplace, not like you have here, so neat and pleasant, but a marketplace in Jerusalem or in the shtetl in Eastern Europe, where you're arguing over every tomato, the price of every tomato, and trying to avoid getting the rotten ones, you realize how difficult it is to serve God in the marketplace, in the everyday world with real conflict. That's the urgent task, the exigent imperative for Buber, to learn to serve God in the marketplace, not necessarily in the synagogue at this juncture. And therefore Buber, as you all recall, deferred any question of renewing Jewish spiritual life via the mitzvot and synagogal practice. Rosenzweig took another point of view, as you know. Referring to the same midrash, Rosenzweig questioned Buber's summary rejection of the mitzvot, the traditional ritual precepts set by tradition as the proper context of Jewish spirituality and divine service. Since these precepts have been codified as laws strictly regulating the spiritual life of the Jew, Buber concurred with those who dismissed the mitzvot as, forgive the fancy word, a heteronymous distortion. Heteronymous means something that's imposed upon you, a law that's imposed upon you. A heteronymous distortion of biblical teachings, and Buber insisted that God, quote, is not a lawgiver, and therefore the law, the Torah, has no universal validity for me. Rosenzweig criticized Buber for yielding to Western bias regarding traditional Jewish ritual practice, which had been ironically supported by the defensive posture of modern orthodoxy and its efforts to shield tradition with the protective mantle of a law demanding unswerving obedience. That is, Rosenzweig also felt that the Orthodox casting Jewish observance as law was an ironic way of concurring with those who claimed that Judaism was a heteronymous body of legalism, something that's imposed upon you. They got it wrong as well, according to Rosenzweig. Had Buber sought to consider the mitzvot phenomenologically, that is, within its spiritual dynamic, Rosenzweig commented, he would have readily acknowledged that as experience, as lived, by the pious Jew, the mitzvot are hardly laws, but a rhapsodic occasion to behold God's presence. On the basis of this observation, Rosenzweig formulated a theological principle for Jewish renewal. Regarded as a personal address to each of us, the mitzvot may, in fact, be the occasion for renewing this individual Jew's dialogue with God. Buber failed to see this possibility. Rosenzweig implied, for he misunderstood. Buber failed to see this possibility, Rosenzweig implied, for Buber misunderstood the dialectical nature of tradition. Reenactment of the rituals and rites, the mitzvot performed by one's ancestors is not to be construed as an atavistic exercise depriving one of the freedom of an autonomous expression of devotion. Jewish tradition, Rosenzweig argued, is rather informed by a unique dialectic whereby one is by virtue of the very same ritual act both the child of his and her ancestors and one's grandchildren's ancestors. Through the renewal of the mitzvot, to be sure renewed with passion and existential integrity, one becomes a vital link in an ever-renewing eternity, an eternity that allows Jewry to attain the sacred detachment that Buber was prepared to find only in the study of sacred texts. And I read from Rosenzweig. For what may be a hard task for other nations, that is, to turn back in, that is, to resist the onrushing stream of life because they consider themselves united by time and space, that is, secular history and territory, and only on festive days and in hours of destiny do they, the other nations, feel as members in a chain of generations. This is just the very basis of our communal and individual life. The feeling of being our father's children, our grandchildren's ancestors, therefore we might rightly expect to find ourselves again and sometimes, somehow, in our father's very words and deed, and also that our own words and deeds will have some meaning for our grandchildren. For we are, as Scripture puts it, children. We are, as the tradition reads it, builders. The venerable vessel of Jewish tradition, Rosenzweig reminded Buber, comprises not only of sacred texts, but also sacred deeds. And in remaining true to the tradition, the Jew paradoxically conserves and renews that tradition. Thus, grounded anew in tradition, the age-old matrix of Jewish prayer and ritual and learning, the Jew reestablishes his or her relation to the eternal. For Rosenzweig, the experience of eternity, of an existence beyond external life, is ultimately achieved by assuming a meta-historical posture. That is, through our imagination and spiritual life, the Jew is to stand beyond history, the realm, the arena of national conceits and struggle. By sequestering itself in the synagogue and the sacred rhythms of the ancient Hebrew liturgy, Israel, the Jewish people, gains an intimation of Messianic time. Anticipating redeemed existence, Israel stands above not only the invidious wiles of history, but also the divisive cadences of secular time. Observing that the Jew does not pray when it moves him or her, but at the given time and in the community of fellow Jews who have gathered in accordance with a fixed schedule, Rosenzweig discerns in synagogal prayer a cultic quality. With a ceremonial exactness reminiscent of the temple cult, the prayer service follows an agenda that might seem to an outsider to be gratuitously rigid, even legalistic. And here, so we just have an idea what he's referring to. If any of you ever visited Israel, and some of you certainly have, and some of you will, you may remember that on Friday night, it's on the Friday newspaper, there's a list of telling us when the Sabbath begins. In Jerusalem, it may begin at 5:34, in Haifa at 5:36, in Tel Aviv, at least parts of Tel Aviv, 5:36. Eilat, they don't observe Shabbat, so it's not mentioned. But Beersheba, it'll be 5:39 and whatever. It seems strange. Why so exact? Why this legalism, if you wish? And this is what Rosenzweig is referring to. The Sabbath begins the week in Jerusalem. I wrote here. The Sabbath begins this week in Jerusalem on Friday evening at 5:43, and not 5:30 or 5:46. And all the house of Israel recites the same prayers, celebrate and commemorate with the same words at the same time. The cultic prayer of the synagogue, according to Rosenzweig, thus has the unique power to quicken the experience of eternity, of redeemed time, which witnessed the primal unity which witnesses the primal unity of humanity. Again, this is the last quote, but you'll allow me. But does the synagogal prayer really have the power to force eternity to accept its invitation? Is the cult really more than just the preparation of food and drink, the setting of the table, the dispatch of messengers to bid the guests? Admittedly, we realize that eternity can become time in the cult, but how are we to understand that it must become time constrained with the power of magic? The cult too appears merely to build the house in which God may take up residence. But can it really force the exalted guests to move in? Yes, it can. For the time which the cult prepares for the visit of eternity is not the time of an individual. It is not mine, nor thine, nor his secret time. And here Rosenzweig is referring to the fact that each of us, although we share the same mathematical time, if you wish, for each of us it is 9, whatever it may be at this moment. 6 minutes after 9, according to my watch. But some of you may be, oh, the lecture's going so beautifully. It's others, you just feel terribly bored and belabored, and oh, it's stretching out. In other words, there's, of course, a texture to time as we experience it. And we're each living a different moment in our lives than the other. I just celebrated 3 weeks ago my 60th birthday, and I can't get used to it. And others, you are looking forward to your next birthday. Others may be hungry, others may be sad, others may be in a particularly joyful moment. Our experience divides us. That's what he's referring to. But in the time of prayer, that divisive character of our experience of time changes, is transformed into common time. So let me just repeat so you follow. For the time which the cult prepares for the visit of eternity is not the time of an individual. It is not mine, nor thine, nor his secret time. It is the time of all. Day, week, and year are the common property of all. They are based on the cosmic orbit of an earth which patiently bears them all, and in the law of the earthly work, which is common to all. The bell, and we actually have a bell in Jerusalem, tells us Shabbos. The bell tolls the hour for every ear. The times which the cult prepares are owned by none to the exclusion of all others. The prayer of the believer takes place in the midst of the believing congregation. In assemblages, he praises the Lord. The enlightenment, it's not the enlightenment that we know from France and Germany. The German word is Erleuchtung, which means to be enlightened, which befalls the individual can here be none other than that which can befall all others too. And in this enlightenment, since it is supposed to be common to all, the same should be enlightened for all. It is a common to all beyond all individual points of view and beyond differences of perspective conditioned by the differences of these points of view. And so it can be but one thing, the end of all things, the ultimate things. Whatever lies beyond the way, along the way, would appear differently to each person according to the place where he was standing. Every day has a different content for each person according to the day that he or she is living. Only the end of days is common to all. The searchlight of prayer illuminates for each only what it illuminates for all, only the Father's, the kingdom. And by this, Rosenzweig wishes to say that Jewish prayer, according to this rigorous schedule, ultimately gives us a foretaste of redemption, of Messianic time. I'll be using in the next paragraphs a fancy word, but it just fits in the rhythm, so forgive me, it's not pure pretension. It is pretension, but not pure pretension. The term is derived from Greek grammar, prolepsis, when we speak in the present, but referring to the future. You call your child, Jonathan, come for dinner. I'm coming, Mom. And of course, he's still watching TV or doing whatever. So, I'm coming, Mom, is a prolepsis. In adjectival form, we say proleptic. But it has more than that when used in this context. It means a concrete existential anticipation of the future, where you really feel the future. Born by the proleptic power of synagogal prayer, the congregation of Jewish worshippers gains a glimpse of redemptive eternity, overcoming for a glorious moment the existential isolation that characterizes human existence in ordinary, unredeemed time. An isolation that Rosenzweig well appreciated was radically deepened by the ascendancy of liberal individualism and the concomitant weakening of community. Rosenzweig also acknowledges that with the conclusion of the prayer service, the Jew exits the synagogue and returns to the mundane order. But the experience of eternity, insisted, is not confined to the synagogue and the occasion of cultic worship. The experience in the synagogue and other sacred acts, such as fulfillment of the mitzvot and Talmud Torah study, in which the Jew participates, cast what Walter Benjamin called chips of Messianic time into the world of quotidian, everyday struggle and ambition. The synagogue is thus, for Rosenzweig, not simply a Messianic refuge, protecting the Jew from the fury and torments of history. Facilitating the experience of eternity, the synagogue is a beacon illuminating the eschatological horizon, Messianic horizon, humbly reminding secular humanity, which includes both Jew and Christian and all others in their everyday lives, of the last things and prompting humanity to push forward and not to despair. In a world increasingly bereft of community and hope, the synagogue as a prefiguration of the Messianic future becomes especially urgent and that much more compelling. Again, this fancy word, the proleptic power ascribed by Rosenzweig to the synagogue to anticipate the redeemed future and render it palpable, and thus an inspiring pocket of a superior reality in the present, is but a particularly intense instance of a characteristic of faith in general. The poet Ludwig Strauss accordingly referred to faith as projecting one onto, quote, islands of messianic time, where one periodically sojourns to behold a future and blessed reality, a reality that for Strauss personally was disclosed by a faith expressed not in ritual and formal religious rite, but in the imaginative deed of writing poetry. For Buber, dialogue also had a proleptic quality. Dialogue is an act of faith, a reaching out in trust to the other, and anticipating a world which, in bold contrast to ordinary experience, is amenable to the dialogical gesture, to the attentive, caring gesture of one to the other. Dialogue is guided by a trust that in turning and thus opening oneself to another, a vow with attentive care, one will not be rebuffed, misunderstood, or hurt. Faith, therefore, reaches beyond the precincts of secular experience and assumes or anticipates an alternative messianic reality. So conceived, faith may also be the path to the longed-for second naivete, second innocence. For from the shores of the Messianic islands, to return to Ludwig Strauss's image, whither faith brings us, we do not, indeed cannot forget the raging waters of unredeemed time, but view them with what Ernst Simon calls an optimistic skepticism, a skepticism emboldened by hope, and alternatively, a critical messianism, a critical evaluation of the present informed by a vision of the future. Both Buber and Rosenzweig presented their respective conceptions of Judaic faith as a path to this renewed and somber innocence, and also as an alternative to the ersatz, the false community and solidarity proffered by nationalism and what we now call civil religion. Rather than the solidarity of shared pride and sentiment, emotions that are notoriously mercurial, unpredictably oscillating, and are often defined over and against the other who is not a member of one's group, they raised a vision of bonds forged in faith, of love and mutual trust. They thus, Buber and Rosenzweig, illuminated the possibility of a post-traditional Jewish identity that is intellectually, spiritually, and ethically engaging. Incredible. I thank you for your patience. Any questions?
Well, you've referred to nationalism many, many times. in this lecture mostly as a negative comparison to another kind of solidarity that emerges through redemptive movements,
Yes.
which I guess come under the framework of Jewish renewal. And the first image you talked about that I heard about second naivete, it's possible to regard Jewish nationalism as an attempt to recapture a second naivete, that is, to go back before the books almost. To go back before the books, before the rabbinic tradition, and try to reestablish something that is, so to speak, mythologically imminent on the earth. And yet, from your analysis, I would think that you would probably agree with the statement that that's a very big failure. That is, nationalism can't achieve that, cannot achieve that. You also talked about nationalism othering the other and what that does ethically. So I just wanted to ask if you're willing to apply some of these categories. How do you see the situation in Israel now?
Okay. What's your name, sir?
My name's David Seidenberg.
Yeah. David, you heard me well. You get an A. I did cast nationalism as something problematic and negative within the context of this discussion. Certainly nationalism, which appeals to human solidarity, the communal solidarity, is a way of trying to recapture community, but I think it's a short-sighted, myopic way of doing such. And certainly with respect to Judaism, it is shortchanging, if you wish to put it in a vulgar way, Judaism. Judaism has far greater resources to creating human solidarity than appeals to nationalism, which has, of course, the effect of othering the other. Just one word about Israel, if that's what you asked me about. Of course, Israel means the Jewish people, and to be exact, I'm very defiant about this. I live in the state of Israel. All Jews are part of the community of Israel. Jews who live in Seattle are the children of Israel as much as I, who resides in Jerusalem. But you're referring to the state of Israel. Well, there is an autobiographical dimension, I must admit. I am deeply alarmed about nationalism as a form of Jewish community. I think it's a dangerous and unhappy situation. I would like to see a much more vibrant, culturally responsible and informed type of Judaism animating the soul of my fellow Israelis. Yes, please.
In the introduction that I offered, I wondered what you'd think that Torah could mean in a postmodern Jewish setting. Now, it can't mean, obviously, a simple text that must be believed or dispensed with. But we do have things in the tradition called the Torah Sheval Peh, the Torah Shebiktav, the written Torah and the oral Torah. And in the Judaisms that continue to exist in post-traditional times among communities of learners, Torah continues to be deepened and broadened and developed in ongoing textual traditions. Where among the post-traditional Jews, or those Jews who consider themselves post-traditional, will you find Torah?
Right. First, I forgot to mention that we should all celebrate with Martin. He just published a week or two ago a wonderful book, which I began to read on the oral Torah, published by Oxford University Press, which is one step a little bit higher than University of Washington Press, but certainly not the demean University of Washington Press, but it's clearly an indication of the esteem that the scholarly community accords Martin. And so I take the opportunity of saying Mazal Tov. And it's well worth reading. I began to read it. It's a marvelous book. If I thought you would capture me, or somebody would question me, well, however you refer to me, Paul, Mendes-Flor, or whatever, you present the cultural memory as something that is far broader than simply tradition. It's something that's able to comprehend the 5 C's of which we spoke in the second lecture, which the 5 C's that constitute traditional Judaism. And through cultural memory, you include something much larger. And then you seem to focus in on 2 gentlemen, 2 great Jewish figures of the 20th century, who sought to revalorize, to give new energy, new meaning to a Judaism based in faith. Two divergent paths, but in many ways, of course, similar. Because for both Buber and Rosenzweig, the challenge was how they, as Jews who have been secularized, can speak about God. They first struggled to find a way, a language of talking about God anew. Not just simply say God is a word that frightens many of us, a word that's been worn thin by misuse, at least what seems to be misuse. But they both brought Judaism back to a Torah-centered passion. I underscored for Buber, the reconstruction of a Jewish cultural memory meant a responsible, informed study of the tradition, of all the texts of tradition. That's true of Rosenzweig as well. They diverged with respect to whether it should be in the synagogue or elsewhere, whether the grammar of our spiritual life as Jews should be determined by the fulfillment of the mitzvot, all the precepts, or not. But they clearly were devoted to a renewal of a Judaism that is literate in the sacred texts of the tradition. There are other possibilities, of course, of a responsible cultural or a responsible reaffirmation of cultural memory than what Buber and Rosenzweig represented. I simply use them in order to highlight two things. One is that Judaism is a spiritual process, an unending spiritual process, in which when each of us participate, we're not simply repeating and recalling what others had done, but we're attaching ourselves to a process that constantly grows, although constantly referring back to itself. That's what the term hyperlectic refers. So it remains part of the same weave, and yet we're adding to it. There are other possibilities of doing that, and in the book form, I will certainly explore those as well. Okay. Thank you. Good night.